Hello there, dreamers. I'm here to address the idea of how rights might fit into your creative project. If you're world building, whether it be an ancient civilization, modern or futuristic, people's rights and laws reflect the mentality of the population, or at least the legislators, and this can have a dramatic effect on the kind of perspectives your characters might have about morality and justice. Rights exist to facilitate the lives and livelihoods of the people. They are forced into existence after times of strife and oppression. Laws are derived from these rights, creating tools of enforcement to prevent the crimes of the past from surfacing again. What kinds of rights will fit into your world? What laws and customs will emerge from them? Let's have a quick saunter through history for some inspiration. If we look back at ancient Egypt or Greece, the notion of individual rights was absent. There was a tacit acknowledgement that the city or state should enable people to provide sustenance for themselves, but it didn't go further than that. Your destiny was the purview of the gods, and notions of what ought to be on a moral scale could be perceived as a challenge to their judgment. Socrates himself was accused of not believing in the gods, and instead creating his own, even though he never said as such. It was his philosophy of starting from a place of ignorance and using logic to determine what he should believe and do that challenged the status quo. The first instances of citizen rights that occurred in human history came into being in the ancient Roman Empire. At the very start of the Roman Empire, they had kings. There were 6 consecutive kings, starting with King Romulus. Romulus started the centuries according to the accounts of Plutarch, and it's not entirely clear exactly how it all worked. I'm glossing over a lot here to get to the relevant part, but the king ceded power to the patricians who formed a senate which held power for hundreds of years. But of course that system became corrupt. They passed laws that benefited themselves and subjugated the people, or plebeians as they are referred. The people pushed for protections, protesting and rioting when things became unbearable, imposing their advantage in numbers against the patricians, so the first 2 human rights were formed at roughly the same time, and they both blew my mind when I learned about them. Firstly, there was the right to appeal. Yes, you heard me. The right to appeal your legal case if you've been convicted of a crime goes all the way back to ancient Rome, somewhere in between the First and Second Punic Wars, when the Roman Empire was in full swing and hadn't turned into a dictatorship yet. The other right, which again was made at about the same time, was the Lex Agraria, the right to land. Massive swaths of land were expropriated from the extremely wealthy in order to make space for every citizen to have a plot of land to call home. With that said, bear in mind, just because you lived in the Roman Empire didn't mean you were a citizen. Of course they had slaves and various tiers of individuals, but the aspiration to become a Roman citizen mirrors the desire of many people to become citizens of first world countries in the modern day. If you were a citizen, it meant something. In ancient Britain, both before and after the invasion of the Normans, the notion of rights had somewhat waned. There was the notion of the common law. This is akin to the modern social contract, albeit simplified. There wasn't any police force as such, but as long as you behaved yourself, you were protected by the law. If you broke the law, you became outside of the law, or an outlaw, as one would say. Anyone could commit a crime against you without repercussion, because if rights were a thing at all, they were the exclusive property of the king, and as such, weren't really rights. Now how could I possibly do a video about rights without mentioning the good old Magna Carta? Written in 1215, the Magna Carta stripped King John of some of his power by offering the people some inalienable rights, the most famous and enduring of which was Habeas Corpus. Literally translated, this means, you may have the body, but in legal terms, it means that every individual accused of a crime has the right to a trial and due process. It is a staple of modern civilization. Now I really want to press for a moment just how critical habeas corpus was to the development of law as we understand it today. It's come to my attention that there are those today who aren't aware that it is the very thing that allows you to defend yourself against any accusations that the government might launch against you.
At what point did you shoot the clerk?
I shot the clerk.
Yes, when did you shoot him?
I shot the clerk.
Hey, Dean, we need you out here.
I'm in the middle of a damn confession here.
In effect, every piece of modern jurisprudence is built upon this one document, and without it, the whole system could crumble, allowing for any mad king to do as he pleases with whomever he wants. Is there such a document in your own fictional world? Fast forward to the Middle Ages and we meet with the concept of the Lex Naturalis, or rather, natural law. Notions of this idea had been around since Aristotle, but Albertus Magnus formalised the concept in the Catholic Church, and Thomas Aquinas refined it as a moral code that lies within the soul and is determined by one's conscience. This marked an epoch of moral superiority of the Church, which it had been trying to acquire since the Gregorian Revolution over 100 years earlier, which enforced celibacy among the clergy and outlawed simony, which allowed for church possessions and even titles to be sold. With the moral law being the exclusive purview of the Church, this is one of the many factors that solidified the separation of moral and secular law. Aquinas wrote that if a law wasn't moral, it wasn't a law at all. These laws presupposed certain rights, such as the right to property or the right to revolution, to supplement these laws, in a way having the philosophical cart pull the horse. The modern concept of right of property and private ownership first occurred in the 1600s with the formation of the first European companies. At first these were only available to the already wealthy, but the notion of meritocracy eventually emerged, where any hard-working individual could fashion their assets to their advantage and make their own fortune in the free market. Thus, the myth of capitalism was born and later elaborated upon by Adam Smith, which is a subject for another video. But speaking to the mentality of people at the time, the right of property wasn't just something people should have. People like Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel posited that the possession and utilization of property was to exercise one's will. It was an expression of freedom, which really speaks to how the communal notion of rights can dramatically affect how a populace can perceive their environment. How would such a thing affect the behaviours and opinions of people in your own fictional world? The right of primogeniture and the right of inheritance allowed a man to secure his legacy into posterity by handing all his belongings to his sons upon his death, as seemed to be a natural right. In your own creation, how would inheritance work? Is it simply the right of the firstborn, or is it patriarchal and handed only to a son? Should everything be distributed evenly among heirs, or given to a sole recipient? Should it be earned? Are there any other conditions? It's good food for thought. The right to freedom of speech ran rampant through the Western world throughout the 18th century in response to generations of despotic rule from Prussia to France to England and throughout the multitude of colonies across the globe. The inequality of France was such that people had nothing to eat while the nobles hoarded all their wealth and property. Hence the phrase, "let them eat cake," although, to be fair, that was actually propaganda. Sentiments like this were reflected in literature, philosophy, and media at the time, but of course the newspapers that spoke out ended up getting shut down in order to censor criticism against the system. Karl Marx identified this as the final catalyst for the French Revolution of the 1700s, though he was certain such a revolution would take place in Prussia, especially when the newspaper where he worked as an editor was closed down in the same fashion, though that revolution didn't come to pass. Despite the overthrow of the French monarchy, another revolution happened in France a mere 50 years later. This in turn inspired the likes of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon to criticise the constitution of 1793 and the system that replaced one set of oligarchs with another. He argued that property itself was robbery and that the right to property of the natural world should be split evenly between those who inhabit it. The only individual right to a thing should be that which the individual creates himself. If a man uses a field to grow crops, the product of his labour should be his, but the field remains the property of all. The mere right of first occupancy is meaningless if the owner isn't present to use it in perpetuity. The notion of owning a field only to have another man work in it and claim the right of the crops produced, and then compensate the worker for a fraction of the value of his labour, was nothing but theft. He showed with his enthusiastic and polemic style that the right of equality was at odds with the right of property, and that the right of equality was a far more just goal to aspire to. This outspoken ideology resonated with the proletariat, and Proudhon was far more popular than Karl Marx back in their day. If you have an industrial era fictional setting, even if these things aren't the focus of your story, it would be reasonable to have such things going on around the story. Details of a living world breathe life into a story. even if they don't intersect directly. Of course, you can't get far past the right of free speech without the question of the right to freedom at large. Is there slavery in your world? Are there underground resistance forces looking to liberate the oppressed? If there is slavery, how is a slave determined? Are they the losers of a battle, like those in the Roman Empire? Or perhaps defined by physical characteristics like its colonial iteration? How does this system actually function? And how does it affect both victims and its perpetrators? Samuel L. Jackson's character in Django Unchained struck me when I watched it. A man so thoroughly brainwashed by his oppressors that being a good and loyal slave became something noble and inherently right. It was something so core to his identity in his old age that he couldn't even comprehend the notion of freedom. And even given what he did, I feel he deserved better in the end. Rachel Felix, better known as Mademoiselle Rachel, was a French actress in the 1840s and 50s. She died of tuberculosis in 1858, and the efforts of newspapers to publish photos of her on her deathbed led to the introduction of privacy rights in French law. The idea of a right to privacy has been a political battleground right up until today. With companies scraping our information to sell onto other companies, governments wanting our identifying information, and even going so far as to track our online fingerprints, examining and analysing what we watch, as well as our habits and behaviours to try and predict our needs and wants to exploit them to their own advantage. Where is the line with this kind of thing? People don't seem to mind as long as it's unnoticeable and inconsequential in the moment, especially when it actually comes to reading the terms of service.
When you downloaded the last iTunes update, a window on your screen popped up and asked you if you agreed to our terms and conditions. You clicked agree. Alright, let's get him to the water tank.
But knowledge is power. And there's a variety of great books and movies exploring the repercussions of the concentration of such knowledge in the hands of a sinister few. How might you express this in your own work? Lastly, what about the right to be forgotten? With so much of our lives documented with videos and posts plastered all over the internet to be gawked at in posterity, should one have the right to have their existence reduced to the essential paperwork for historical reference? Does it even matter? Imagine a funeral procession where deleting one's internet presence was a part of the cremation process. How about crafting your own rights for your world? Well, what is the fundamental purpose of rights in the first place? I would say it's first and foremost to facilitate life and healthy living conditions for any given populace. It's shocking how in the modern day there are those who think the right to food and water is still debatable, but that's capitalism for you. But let's think about how certain conditions might make certain rights necessary in a fictional setting. Think of a world enveloped in water. People's homes are islands amidst the endless ocean. Communities could perhaps be settled upon flotillas out in the sea. Should an individual have a right to a boat? Perhaps they need to sail to the one and only local island where crops can be grown in order to acquire food. But what if there aren't enough resources for everyone to have a boat? Perhaps a right to a transport service that comes by regularly, be it once a day, week, or month, to provide people with necessities to live in the tough environment? Would the people demand a right to such a thing? I would imagine so. But what are the complications with a thing like that? What would the motivation be to withdraw such a right? How about a contemporary setting? Do you think it might be reasonable to have a right to an iPhone? In a world where access to the internet is becoming more and more of a necessity in modern life, should such a thing be considered a right? When was the last time you saw a new phone come out with a new feature that had a meaningful impact for the user? Innovation on that front has ground to a halt. Every new phone is virtually identical to the last, as we've apparently reached the best form a phone can take. If there's no more room to grow, companies have already made incredible profits from them, and they're critical to modern life. Then why not make them a right? Is this a fact that your world has taken as common sense? If a phone is broken, could someone walk to a nearby government facility for a new one, free of charge? What about the contradiction of rights? Something that seems reasonable to a shallow thinker, but in practice is actually detrimental to society. For example, there are some in the world today who think that companies should have a right to profit, or that countries should have a right to defend themselves or to exist. The problem with handing rights to entities, no matter how reasonable they may sound, is that they become equivalent to human rights, And if human rights exist to facilitate life and health, then conflating these rights becomes dangerous. When a judge or legislator is faced with a starving population because a company has bought the land where all the food is grown, expropriating that food so people won't starve would impinge on the profits of the company. So if these things are equivocated, which do you choose when the people can't afford to pay? Rights should be there to ensure the well-being of people, full stop. But corrupting this concept for your own story would be a great way to create conflicts, and no story is interesting without good drama.
We're living in a dictatorship, a self-perpetuating autocracy in which the working classes...
Oh, there you go, bringing class into it again.
If you're liking the video so far, I'd really appreciate if you liked and subscribe. And of course, there's my newsletter in the description below. I'd really appreciate it if you signed up for that. I'll provide you every 2 weeks with new videos and updates on my projects, including my Kickstarter for my game, Conflict of Dreams. And you can join us in the Discord to play the game online. Here I'd like to put in a bit of an asterisk about when I said that the Lex Agraria and the right to appeal were the first rights to appear in human history. There was the Urukagina of Lagash in 2350 BC and the Cyrus Cylinder in 539 BC, which suggests legal reforms, and in the case of Cyrus the Great, the abolition of slavery in Babylon and Persia, but there's a significant lack of historical evidence to support these conclusions, as well as modern interpretations to the contrary. Secondly, there's the modern notion that right isn't right unless everyone is entitled to it, whereas in ancient Rome, you had to be a citizen to enjoy these rights. But I'm counting it because of how well documented these are, as well as the idea that they are collectively the concept of rights in its infancy, and are therefore not yet matured into our contemporary understanding. And lastly, a quick disclaimer that this is not a comprehensive list of rights by any stretch of the imagination. Be sure to do your own digging into this. How will it affect your community? And what kind of conclusions could you draw from your situation that would force people to desire certain rights? And of course, this is Jim. Jim is a lycanthrope who works as a scribe on a submarine. That's right, he's a lycan subscribe. Jim has been an outspoken activist for animal rights ever since he became a werewolf, though one could question if it isn't something of a pursuit of self-interest. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and like and subscribe. Have a good day.